This is Martin Giles of the Guildford Dragon News, and I'm here to interview the leader of the opposition at Surrey County Council, who's also the leader of the Liberal Democrats at Waverley Borough Council, or rather the leader of that council, and also a former Lib Dem candidate in the last general election where he narrowly lost to Jeremy Hunt. And we're going to be talking about yesterday's decision by the government to prefer the two unitary authority solution for Surrey's future local governance over the three unitary solution that was put forward by the majority of Surrey's 11 boroughs and districts. Councillor Follows, welcome back to the Guildford Dragon News, and thank you for
Good morning,
giving your
Martin.
time for this interview. What do you're with that experience, you're well placed to make some overall comments about this decision, but of course you'll be coming from your own political angle, understandably. But what do you think of yesterday's decision, and what does it say about the state of democracy in England, given that it wasn't the popular decision when they in the consultation, nor amongst the majority of councils here in Surrey? So, what do you think it does say? You're a Liberal Democrat, so what do you think it says about the state of our local democracy?
Well, in the first instance, the most important thing to remind everybody, although I'm sure they haven't forgotten, is that the elections for Surrey County Council were cancelled as part of this process. So the whole issue of devolution, local government reorganisation, none of that was put to the electorate by the government in their own general election manifesto. This is not something that they were upfront about as something they wanted to do. So I don't think the public really had any great say on that. So the Conservatives who lead Surrey County Council obviously petitioned the government to enact this local government reorganisation process. They chose to do that. That was not something they were forced to do by the government. They chose to do that. And as a result, the government cancelled the election. So there was no debate, there was no electoral mandate from anybody to engage in any kind of local government reorganisation, let alone the specific one that Surrey County Council did undertake. And so they undertook that. It was opposed by the opposition parties at the county. We're obviously in the minority, so they won. The government cancelled the elections, started this process. But then that process in itself has been, as you said, I think deeply undemocratic and deeply fraught. And what we've seen is the majority of districts and boroughs opposed the plans of the county council for two big unitaries, in this case, stretching from Hazelmere to Staines, rather insanely. And you saw, I think, through the consultation results that were released yesterday, that the majority of the public of Surrey also opposed the two unitary model that the county were proposing. And yet, the government have agreed to absolutely every single thing the county wanted, which is against the will of most councillors in Surrey, most councils in Surrey, and the people of Surrey. And it says an awful lot about what democracy means to the government and to the county council, in my opinion.
Yes, according to Gov UK, the two unitary proposal received negative responses. 56% said no, and only 19% said yes.
Absolutely. And I think actually if they'd have opened the question up further to do you want this process at all, you'd have almost certainly had I think a positive result for that, certainly based on my discussions with many hundreds of process. But I think the results from that consultation were clear. The government obviously saw that and have decided to take the decision they've taken, which I would categorize as not just undemocratic and certainly problematic for the future, but lazy. I mean, they're thinking only about the county's vision of what the money looks like now, which I don't believe was accurate, by the way. But they're thinking only about that and not about the next 50 years, which is what local government reorganisation needed to be about. It's such a wasted opportunity to have done what they've done and take this lazy decision, in my opinion.
Okay, but there are advantages to unitary authorities, aren't there? I mean, they are simpler to understand. One council is responsible for all the services. There may be opportunities for economies of scale, making them cheaper and more efficient. And there is a unified control. They are undeniable advantages of unitary authorities, aren't they?
So I actually, as a concept, I've supported unitary authority, and although I have to say, at far smaller population sizes than the ones the government seem to be pushing. I mean, the new West Surrey is going to be over 600,000 people. The sorts of unitaries I think would make sense. of area that covers, say, Guildford and Waverley right now. I think that would have made an ideal unitary size in the way that we used to think about this. But yeah, those benefits that you've articulated, I wouldn't disagree with them in principle. Right now, if you knock on the doorstep and a resident tells you about issues that they've raised, they certainly don't know or care in the main that it's a town council, a borough council, or a county council matter. They just want you to do the thing, and I
Yeah.
get that. And I think most residents would prefer a simplicity when it comes to engaging with local authorities. But making it this huge, actually, how are they supposed to engage with their local authority? I mean, this new one, West Surrey, it's going to stretch, as I said, from Hazelmere to Staines. So where is that HQ going to be? Which part of the county of the new unitary authority is that going to be? Can residents from Godalming or Guildford easily just walk over to the office if it's in Staines, or Ashford Town, or centre of Runnymede, or something like that? There are going to be a lot of questions, and I don't think a unitary of this size makes it simple for residents. I think it makes it quite monolithic for residents, and I would have preferred a far smaller footprint, as we've argued repeatedly as Liberal Democrats.
And conversely, if you're a councillor in Spelthorne, and let's say Guildford was chosen as the seat of the new unitary, with traffic in Surrey as we've experienced it, coming down to Guildford isn't going to be easy for them.
Why, just as an aside, for obvious reasons, I've been trying to learn about some of the differences and issues in the different parts of the county. And other than the vast disparities in types of issues that you see between, say, urban Spelthorne on the London borders and rural Waverley or the villages of Guildford, for example, you see huge different issues. But I thought I'll take the train up to Staines. And it took me over 90 minutes, and that's when everything worked fine with 4 train changes to do it. So it is not going to be a very straightforward thing where this council is going to be. Obviously, that's a decision for the new unitary authority to take when the time comes. But there are lots of issues for this now massive territory to absorb.
Now, you have mentioned the disparity in character of the different parts of this new unitary. I mean, anyone that knows Spelthorne knows that, it's on the edge of Heathrow Airport. It's a very sort of London suburban character. And yet parts of the south of Waverley in particular are rural. I mean, and it's hard. I would think it would be almost impossible for a councillor with their local experience to judge issues properly when they're affecting residents in the south of Waverley. What do you think?
I mean, good councillors try and listen to their residents and try and hear the issues and try and understand them. And obviously, there is a point where we are now going to be dealing with quite a vast disparity of different types of issues. And in some cases, there'll be issues that, let's say, a councillor in Waverley may not have remotely ever addressed. And you're right, the feel as you go into Spelthorne is a really good example of this. You cross over the M25, you cross over the river. The signs are London transport signs. I mean, there's even part of the Elizabeth line that's going to be extended out, I believe, to part of northern Spelthorne. It very much looks and feels like London. But beyond the look and feel, you actually then dig into the data of what's going on in those areas. You get different types of crime in different proportions. You get different distributions of things like SEN and adult social care and children's services. You've got different highways matters. You've got rural versus urban issues, which obviously crop up in lower levels, even down here in the south of the county. But when you've got that huge disparity up between the north and south, these are things that the new council will have to deal with, all of them. And that's before you get to things like the funding disparities of, say, things like citizens' advice. So nearly no funding in Woking for several years, as I'm sure is very
Mhm.
obvious to anybody who understands the question with Woking. There are lots and dots of different issues, and all of these disparities are going to have to be absorbed and managed by the new council and its new councillors in the shortest ever done by any local authority in the history of the United Kingdom. And that does give me some serious concern.
And one of those challenges is going to be merging the systems and processes, including, of course, IT systems, between the councils, which have got their own problems of IT systems talking to each other within the councils. Can that really be done in the time frame?
So when the government postponed the decision by another 3 weeks just recently, obviously they did do the decision yesterday, but they had postponed it from when they originally told us. And at that point, there was 29 weeks until the elections for that new council. And so by delaying it, they actually took up 10% of the time that we had left to do this. This is usually done over years, and we are already having to do it in about 30 weeks. So it is, I think, trying to take the politics out of it. Just as a if you're doing mergers and acquisitions or anything like this in the private sector or the corporate world or in any other space, you would not wish to rush something so complicated in this way. And in local government, we're having to add, let's also make sure we're still helping, managing, and providing for vulnerable people as well, and keeping ourselves safe and legal and doing all the things we still have to do whilst doing this process in an area that's already got cuts. So I have huge concerns. But the bigger issue, I think, Martin, the one you've alluded to, is that Guildford and Waverley, as many, I know people will have issues with Guildford and Waverley. It's natural, we're local authorities. But at the end of the day, Guildford and Waverley are by far the two most stable councils in this side of Surrey. In fact, within Surrey in general, Guildford and Waverley are very there as the two stable. And together have made ourselves even more stable and cost effective and trying to deliver for residents. Obviously, there's a political opinion in there. People can unpack that, but the numbers are very clear about the stability of Guildford and Waverley versus the rest of the county. It has been a challenge even to integrate Guildford and Waverley systems together. The idea of doing this in 30 weeks or not much longer than that for an entire West Surrey is just simply unachievable.
And yet, presumably, someone has looked. I mean, if we just look at the IT systems, which is something I know a little bit about in government, I mean, the idea of merging them, that's going to be a. Have they calculated the cost of that? Because there's not the skills within the councils to do that, I wouldn't imagine. So you're going to have to get lots of consultants in who will be charging a pretty penny per day to even try and do that.
I wouldn't want my smiling to come across in a different way, but the fact that we've had these discussions with the county over the course of a year now, nearly December, this all started by the government and the county. The fact that we know for sure that the county didn't really do its costings before they put in the initial letter. And we also know that it was only very, very late in the day, which was confirmed by BBC reporting, that the government itself did a first go of some of these costings. There is no way that they understand, or indeed, I think, care at this point about the level of issues that are going to be created here. This is going to be one of the most serious challenges for local government anywhere in the history of our country. And you know, the real issue for me is this should have been one of the best opportunities for a genuine democratic change to have a more responsive, more open, and more representative council that really delivered for people. And what's happened is it's been started in this deeply problematic way. And I think once we've dealt with all of these issues, I think we might be able to get to somewhere good. But it is going to take some serious time and energy from some very dedicated people to get this on a good footing.
Now, from an observer's point of view, it seems it could be said that the real motivation of the government here is, in fact, although they've labelled it as devolution, is to actually take more power away from local authorities, especially I mean, they're on the record as saying they want to, override the blockers as they term people that don't like certain planning decisions. Isn't that their real motivation to take away that power so they can just drive through their housing program?
I will caveat this as being more my opinion than anybody else's, rather than a party political one, and a product of political academic being at University of Surrey for a number of years before I did this. I believe that this is an assault on how local government works and on truly representative democracy. I mean, this does not empower local government to work for communities. It just simply doesn't. The planning element of this is one aspect, one important aspect, but one I think they were already seriously eroding anyway through other means. But the United Kingdom is one of the most centralized states in Europe in every single way. And at the local government level, there's almost no empowerment compared to, say, France or Germany or almost any other large equivalent European state. What they have done here, and they've done it under the guise of making things more accountable and democratic, is do the exact opposite. Just practically on the ground, let's use your example of planning, because I think it's one that most people can engage with across Surrey in a sort of common way. we have debates in Waverley about whether councillors in Farnham should be voting on applications in Godalming because they might not know about the details of it. And I know it happens in Guildford with the villages, and a
Mhm,
city
mhm,
centre, or a Guildford town centre councillor might not be aware of the issues out in
mhm,
Tillingbourne. That kind of
mhm,
debate is
mhm,
common in local
mhm.
authorities. What if the planning committee is made up of mostly people from the urban north and they're now being asked to vote on something in the green belt on the edge of Hazelmere or countryside beyond the green belt in Cranley or Tillingbourne or Chilworth or something like that? I mean, it's those sorts of arguments are now dramatically expanded into something completely ridiculous. And I do think this has fundamentally undermined the democratic process. It's made this a more centralized council, and I suspect that was the government's aim. What disappoints me is that the Conservatives right across this county have just bought into that lock stock, and they have been the ones that put forward the proposals to centralise it. They didn't need to do that. That's what they did. They gave the government all the opportunities they need to say yes to that agenda, and that's what's happened.
Okay. Now, another area of difficulty is going to be the legacy debt that the
Indeed.
new unitary is going to have to take on, or at least partly take on, from the debts that exist in Woking, Spelthorne, Runnymede, and of course the county council itself. Now, the government did announce within its overall announcement that they're going to write off half a billion of Woking's debt. Um, is that going to be enough, or how do you see that playing out?
I did seven sort of town hall meetings in Waverley, including one with the leader of Guildford over here. And in every single one of those, I said Woking's debts are so extreme that even if the government gave them what I thought would be the maximum they'd ever give them, which is about £500 million, they'd still be in trouble. And that's oddly exactly what the government have done. They've given £500 million. We haven't seen some of the other terms and conditions of this debt yet, and I would defer to the leader of Woking certainly on a lot of the detail, which she's obviously very much on top of. But there's still some missing elements, like will there be interest freezes and things like that. So there's some detail that may be helpful that we don't have. But the government aren't going to do anything else about any of the other types of debt because, in their view, councils are still balancing their budgets and they haven't crystallised these debts. There are serious issues in Spelthorne and in Runnymede. There are certainly financial elements that need to be looked at in more detail in Surrey Heath, and it is clear the county council also has serious debts. And in my county council hat, that is obviously something that we're going to be looking at, and how assets are distributed east and west, and things like that are going to be important. But at the moment, what I'm working with officers on is trying to get some kind of unified budget book for this whole new unitary. Now we know how big it is, so we can understand what the scale of the problem is. Depending on how you categorize the debt, you're looking at anywhere between, 1.5 billion upwards of potentially pushing six. Not all that debt is bad, but quite a lot of it is. And quite a lot of it might be realised in places like Spelthorne if they have a few bad events, for example. It might crystallise very, very rapidly and be a problem for the new unitary. So we've got to deal with this, and I think we've got ways of looking at that. But actually, the debt, to me, Martin, is actually a bit of a red herring. The debt is something that councils are used to managing, not quite at the scale of Woking, but there are ways of dealing with it. The thing that still concerns me most is that there has been no reform. In fact, it's been delayed for adult social care and special educational needs. There has been no discussion really about how the funding of local authorities actually works in a general way and council tax. There's no discussion about how business rates are apportioned and how that process works. So at the moment, all of the issues that have contributed to the funding problems in local government in Surrey have not been addressed in terms of root causes. So what's going to happen is that a new council is going to be created with many of the same underlying problems as the county had. And the government have pushed that back again. And one of the things I said to the Conservative leader of the county in the full council meeting that kicked all of this off was, until you know what reform is coming in local government funding and social care and all of these other things, how can you in good conscience try and create a new council based on exactly the same rules that clearly don't work now? You need to wait and you need to see what is happening with these fundamentals. Because yes, we've got the debts, but all of the other support is not there. And actually, the government are talking about cuts, net cuts in our budget for this new unitary,
Okay.
even the position that they're in now.
But from the correspondence we get in the at the Dragon, a lot of people do focus on the legacy debt. I mean, how do you think it is something that the public is concerned about?
They're concerned about it, and they're rightly concerned about it. I went to get coffee before this interview, just walking down Godalming High Street, as I often do, and I had five people come up to me just this morning and ask me very specifically about the debt question. I mean, it is something that is within the consciousness, I think, of most residents of this county. If they think local government, they're worried about debt. And you can see why in somewhere like Godalming, in a solvent borough like Waverley, being attached to Woking's debt and other debt is clearly concerning. And I totally get that. And I imagine that a decent chunk of Guildford's population who are engaged with this subject will also be concerned about it. And it is concerning because it has a huge drag on the revenue of the council, and it's going to have a huge legacy on things like discretionary spend. So that spend on things that we're not legally required to do.
Yeah.
So for instance, in Waverley, we do about £400,000 a year to charitable services, things like citizens advice, other providers of social value in our area. If there is no discretionary spend, many of these things that people come to know and use will go. And you only need to look at Woking to see how a complete abolition of discretionary spend, what that looks like. And it worries me. So what we need to try and focus on is making sure that the discretionary spend is not completely eliminated, and many of these social and care provisions that residents rely on are retained in the future. And that is going to be one of my biggest jobs. Don't get me wrong, I've got to run for re-election, and I may be nothing to do with the new unitary authority, but for the next year, it is certainly my job and my fellow leaders' jobs to try and prepare this new unitary to be able to deal with some of these issues.
But the government hasn't got infinite money to give to local councils, and the overall national picture, is we are cash strapped, aren't we? So how would that how else you can understand why they want to try and make savings?
I can, but at the same time, I can also see no changes to how they deal with the economics of this country. So, for example, there's no reform of council tax planned. It's one of the most inefficient systems I've ever seen, based on its valuation, how many bands there are. All of these things are arcane and need review. And it means also that you often see counties like Surrey as being rich because a lot of wealthy people live here. But that's irrelevant if the council can't actually tax accordingly and progressively. It is also very much a way that wealth dwarfs the and hides the social and other types of deprivation that exist within places like Surrey. So the government may base their funding models of something that is inappropriate to many residents. There's also no reform of business rates. There's no reform of capital gains. There are no fundamental methods that the government are using to look at income in this country progressively. They just haven't touched it. And in many respects, I have a great disappointment that the government has been no different from the previous one in terms of actually tackling the root cause of any of these issues. And that's why I'm so upset that nothing is changing in local government. We're actually at this point creating a new council with exactly the same funding issues and policy issues as all of the ones that have just failed before it, because the government have done nothing to change the fundamentals of the economics of local government. And they could have done, they just haven't.
Okay, now we're limited by time, obviously, and I do want to ask you what's going to happen next. I mean, this is England, it's not France. In France, they may be out on the streets demonstrating about this, but here we'll probably just go along with it, and a lot of people may still be unaware that anything is changing. What do you think is going to happen next?
Well, the first thing I think we're all trying to do is tell people what is happening. It's going to be an ongoing job over the next 2 years, particularly. There will be elections in May 2026 for this new council. And the old councils, all 12 of them, will be formally abolished in May 2027. So there's a lot of overlap of things that is going to be confusing for people, I suspect, over the next year, particularly. And people like me leading a council now, we have a role in the initial setup and planning for these new unitaries. And so on the one hand, whilst I am very frustrated about some of the decisions that have been made, I now have a duty, as do my colleagues, to acknowledge the decision has taken place and try and make the best of it for residents. And I believe that we can use our capabilities and skills to try and make this work and to bring this back to being a positive reformation of local government in Surrey. That being said, the county and other of significant actors do need to cooperate and collaborate in that process to make this good. And that's the sort of thing I think that's going to be an issue over the next few weeks and months. What residents are going to start to see, though, is that when that new unitary exists, will they be able to walk down the high street to their council office? No, because I don't know where that will be. We don't know where the departments will be. We don't know where the services will be. And certainly, Liberal Democrats like myself will be trying to ensure that there is local access to council services in each of what will be by then the former boroughs and districts of Surrey, so that we can at least have as an accountable and accessible council as possible under these somewhat ridiculous constraints. And I will also say, Martin, that personally, I've always been a proponent of strong and active town and parish councils, like the one I also lead, Godalming Town Council. And I think that their role, supported by the Unitary, I hope, will grow even more significant in the coming period. And certainly that's where I will also be focusing some of my energy to make strong towns and parishes with a strong voice across what we now call Waverley.
Well, Councillor Paul Follows, we couldn't possibly cover everything in this time, but I do appreciate you giving your time for this interview, which I hope is informative to our readers. And I hope that in future we'll be speaking again and see how it goes.
Thank you, Martin.